the manuscript was not intended to be conserved, and this is why it has been used it has been recycled.
Yeah. Even from the start, you think it was not intended to be preserved?
In my opinion, yes.
Yes.
At the beginning of chapter 9, this reading instruction says, do not say in the name of God at this level of the Quran. Lataqul Bismillah.
Chapter 9, verse 80. Will Allah not forgive just the disobedient or those who don't believe in Muhammad as well? Seems that Sana'a forgot about Muhammad. They added Muhammad's name, just like the prayer and the zakat in the last instance. Here you have in the chain chapter, now Muhammad is added as a means to get forgiveness. The upper layer, he says, represents about 50%. So 50% for the upper layer. He's saying that the lower layer could be anywhere from 11 to 41% of the Quran. He's still now looking at all of it, and he's finding out an awful lot of text down there. What?
Most important thing in the Sana'a, what we call the Sana'a Palimsest, that means the manuscript 27.1 held in Dar al-Makhtutat, is that it's an incomplete Quran, the way, I mean, according to the Quran we know today. It is supposed to be completed by some scholars, suppose that it could be, there's another part of the manuscript in another part of the library. We are still waiting to confirm this idea. To speak about the Quranic variants that occupy the most important part of the discussion. The lower text contains canonical variants. That means all the variants we find in the canonical collections, like Ibn Mujahid collection of variants. So they are, we can identify the variants in the upper text according to what we know about the canonical variants, the qira'at as we know them. The lower text, none of the textual features of the lower text coincide with the Quranic variants, with the canonical Quranic variants. This is why I suggested to think about this phenomenon in the lower text differently, in a way that we do not interpret any textual particularities with the same scope of the Quranic variants. And at this level, I thought we should have more, more possibilities of interpretation. And going back to what I said about the transmission of the Quran and Hadith and other material in circles of transmission in the early Islamic learned milieu, I was thinking when I read the lower text, when they deciphered the lower text, that all the material we have, all the Quranic material we have, or does not necessarily constitute part of a codex. Perhaps we have material that was intended to be used in other channel, and this might explain their storage in the false ceiling of the mosque, and this might explain the low quality of the parchment used to write the lower text, and this might explain the particularities of what we call the non-canonical Quranic variants in the lower text.
Yeah.
I have to say that I did not succeed to identify the variants in the lower text the way other colleagues did. That means I did not find a way to reconstruct some passages in a way that they fit within, for example, Ibn Mas'ud Codex. This was not my interpretation of the script. So my interpretation is subjective, like any other interpretation of the palimpsest, because interpreting this palimpsest is reconstructing, rewriting the text somehow. And this implies a big level of, how to say, objectivity, even if at the end it's still a subjective exercise. So my idea that the lower text perhaps was a school exercise is based on a discussion with the other works on the Sana'a Palimsest. So what Elizabeth Quinn calls deviations are, in my opinion, something should be interpreted in another way, because deviations means that there was necessarily a reference, like a copy, a right copy that the scribe was following. And these deviations explain, following Elizabeth Quinn, the erasure or the washing up of the text. In my opinion, the manuscript was not intended to be conserved. And this is why it has been used it has been recycled.
Yeah. Even from the start, you think it was not intended to be preserved?
In my opinion, yes.
Yes.
My idea, my hypothesis is based on the textual features that I call variation, not variant, to take into consideration that they do not fit with the canonical variant. And is based also, my interpretation is also based on the number of orthographic errors. For example, in folio 6A, in folio 9B, there are orthographic errors made by the scribe and corrected by the scribe himself or herself. Mm-hmm. They are not corrected by a corrector hand, but they're corrected by the same, using the same ink and by the same scribe. Mm-hmm. So, but the most important part of the manuscript is, of the lower text, is the reading instruction. This reading instruction made me think that this might be a school exercise. This reading instruction we find in folio 5A is at the beginning of chapter 9. This reading instruction says, do not say in the name of God at this level of the Quran. Lataqul Bismillah. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, this refers to a context of teaching, learning, perhaps in a dictation session, this passage of the Quran.
Yeah.
And this what made me think about a school exercise. Mm-hmm. This instruction has not been deleted. And there is a basmala indeed that written before this reading instruction. And the very existence of this reading instruction is, in my view, a sign that this manuscript was not intended to be conserved in a mosque or used as a codex for reader or for Muslim, for believers to use.
So thank you for that good and full summary of that. And so just so for clarification for our viewers, what Asma has just talked about, the last part, is one of the things that has been discussed most about her book, which is the idea, number one, that it was a school text, that this originally was something used in a school setting, not for the production of a book. And then secondly, that the part of the text that was written in there was written that said Lataqul Bismillah, after the erasure of the Bismillah at the beginning of chapter 9, is an indication of, or supports this theory. And I don't remember all the details about the, I want to come back to a couple of the other things that you mentioned too, which are interesting, concerning variants versus variations, but there was a presentation made, and I don't remember exactly who made it, at a conference several years ago relating to this issue, where it was pointed out that that same Rasam text, the same skeletal text, could be read on fal.
Yeah.
And with the and I don't know if he saw a shadow of an aleph before that lam, but is one of the it is instructive to remember, and it brings up another issue that I've been dealing with a lot in my work as well, and that is that the rasam can sometimes be read in different ways, and so it's definitely worth thinking about the possibility that not everything was made for production of a mushaf, or not everything that was made for that purpose was actually wound up being used in that purpose. This manuscript was found in between the inner and outer wall of the Sana'a Mosque, along with many others. And I think some of the ones that were found in there, many of them were actually from Masahif, if I'm not mistaken, but for whatever reason, they were stored in that place.
We're actually going to go look at the Sana'a manuscript, and we're going to come to conclusions at it. Many scholars have dated it to around 705. Others have dated it to much later, and there are some that want to date it to even earlier. When you look at that picture on the left, there you can see, I don't have it here, I don't have the Sana'a manuscript, but when you look, those are from Dr. Garrett Quinn's facsimile that he has, the entire one. He was the one that was flown down in 1981 to look at it and to photograph it, and that's part of his photographs there. On the right side of the page there, where the yellow mark is Surah 19. Where the yellow mark is, it ends, that verse ends, that chapter ends, sorry, and it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? They're not there on the right side. Look on the left side of that picture on the left, and you'll see on the left side, Surah 20 begins, but it is a completely different script than what's on the right side, showing that it comes on much later, and this was added at a much later date. So here you can see the evolution in the text just by looking at the manuscript there. A lot more yet to be discovered about the Sana'a manuscript. Now, what you're looking at there is probably the oldest of all the manuscript. There you can see 2 pages, no dots, no vowels. But when they looked at it more carefully, they saw that it was a palimpsest. What do we mean by palimpsest? That means it was a text that was written on animal skin, was then washed off and then written over top. That's what we know by a palimpsest. And this is a palimpsest. So that when you put it under ultraviolet light, like you see on the right there in the blue picture, you can see that there's a lower layer and there's an upper layer. The lower layer is the lighter text. The upper layer is the much more readable text. And the reason why is when they first washed these back in the 8th century, they thought that they had eradicated the text. What they didn't realize is that hundreds of years later, the ink would bleed through, and which it is doing now today. And that's why when you put it under ultraviolet light, you can actually separate the 2 scripts. According to some scholars, the lower text is dated to 671 to 705, and the upper text is dated to 705 and later. So parts of it are from the 7th century, the lower layer, and the parts is from the 8th century, the upper layer. Now, according to Karl-Heinz Oleg, who was with Garrett Quinn when they did their survey back in the 1980s and later, he says the Quran began to be compiled in the last 2 decades of the 7th century. So he's talking about the time of Abdul Malik, the last 2 decades from 685 and on, with other versions continuing up until the 9th century. So he's talking about the other ones like Husseini manuscript. Dr. Garrett Quinn continues, and he says, the oldest parchments and papers of any Quranic manuscript, this is, and yet more than half of the text is ambiguous letters which need diacritical marks for understanding. Adding vowels help correct mistakes. Changes in the orthography, conventional spelling system of the language are found in geographical traditional schools that he refers to. But it's fascinating when you look at the 2 layers, and this is what we want to do now. Let's look at those 2 layers and let's see what we're finding. There you can see the 2 layers. If you look carefully on the left, you can just barely see some of the letters bleeding through. Dr. Asma Hilali has written the only book so far that's been published, and this is it right here. You can see pictured there. This is known as the Sana'a Palimsest. She was just interviewed by Colin from Islamic Critique about a week and a half ago about her book. And I was listening to that interview, and she was very, she stood back from her own book. She pretty much said, I'm not an expert in this field. My area of study is hadith. And so my question was, why did she write a book on this if she's not an expert? And as I've now found out from another scholar who just phoned me last night, to talk about this, he says that really she is not the scholar. She should not have written this book because she made a lot of mistakes in this book. So I just need to say that before we get into her findings. Now, if you look at the upper and lower text, there you can see a graph that she put together of what exists in the lower text and what exists in the upper text. She found that there were 63 verses in the lower text, and within those 63 verses, there were 70 variants, which include verbs and nouns, articles different, participle differences, conjunction differences, preposition differences, isolated letters, expression differences, entire sentences. Some of the examples that we can look at. So when you look at the example list, I'm not going to give you all of them, just give you a few, just so you get a smattering. Here you have chapter 2, verse 88. Where you have Allah curses them either for their injustice or their unbelief. So the significance of this is, does Allah curse you for your simply being bad or for unbelief? That's hugely important depending on, where the curse comes from and what's the reason for it. That would have a theological import. So you can see that would be damaging, theologically speaking, depending on which text you're looking at. The lower compared with the Hafs text. We're not looking at the upper and lower here. We're looking at the lower text variants compared with the Hafs text today. Here you have in chapter 8, verse 74, where it says you could struggle in jihad with their money themselves, or in the case of the text that we use today, did jihad struggle in the name of Allah only? Now, the significance between these two differences, do you carry out jihad with money or only in God's name? Again, that would change the practice. Here's chapter 9, verse 2. They do not escape Allah and his prophet, according to the Sana'a Palimsest, but know that you cannot escape Allah, nothing to do with his prophet there. So in the Sana'a manuscript, it talks about his prophet. In the Kyrie text that we use today, there is no prophet. So do they or you escape just Allah or his prophet as well? That would also have a theological difficulties. Here you're talking about mosques that are maintained by those. And are they maintained by those who just fear Allah, or are they maintained by those who also pray and give zakat? That's been added to the Kyrene text. Praying and giving zakat is not there in the Sana'a Palimsest. So you have another practice here that has been added in a later date, possibly at a later time. Certainly it's there in the current Quran. It's not there in the lower layer of the Sana'a manuscript. Here in chapter 9, verse 80. Will Allah not forgive just the disobedient or those who don't believe in Muhammad as well? Seems that Sana'a forgot about Muhammad. They added Muhammad's name, just like the prayer and the zakat in the last instance. Here you have in the chain chapter, now Muhammad is added as a means to get forgiveness. In chapter 24, verse 27, seek welcome verses and greet those in them. So you can seek welcome as far as the Sana'a manuscript and when you visit somebody, but according to the Kyrene text, you must also greet them. So there is a practice that has been added that would have a change. Now, so you can see this does have differences in the practice, in the belief, and also in the doctrine. Shabir Ali goes on and says there is no difference in belief, no difference in practice, and certainly no difference in doctrine. I've just shown you about 4 or 5 of them where there is difference in practice and belief and also in doctrine. And we could go on with the other 63 if we have more time, but we don't. The upper variants, there you can see the upper variants. This is the upper text, the 705 text, and later compared with the Hafs text. You can see there's quite a few variants there as well. Now, the conclusion, the lower text is dated to the late 7th century, and there's a 50-year gap between the 2 layers. This could suggest that the upper text is a later correction of the lower text. That's what Dr. Elizabeth Quinn, who's probably done the most research so far on it. Or one could question the dating of the lower text, since ink cannot be dated, only the skin of the animal can. So therefore, is it really that much earlier? There are variants in the upper text as well. This suggests that a standard text had not been canonized even in the early 8th century. The view that these texts are results of reading circles, that's Hilali's argument, that these are nothing more than students, is fallacious. Why? First of all, you do not give very expensive parchment to students. You don't do that. You give pieces of cardboard maybe, or you give chalk drawings, but you don't give parchment because they're hugely expensive. You would not waste them on students. Muslims wouldn't have preserved reading circle texts for 1400 years, but have thrown them away and would have certainly preserved the more important canonical texts from which they're derived. Another niggling problem. The biggest difficulty I see is this. These are the oldest Quranic fragments in existence date. This is the oldest manuscript that by most of the scholars claim, from 705 and later. All the other extant manuscripts are more recent. So why are these layered palimpsests the earliest ones? Where is the original Quran from which these supposed reading texts were derived, if they are reading texts? And finally, are these 2 palimpsest layers an example of the nascent Quran in its early formation, or are there either of these 2 layers parallel to the eternal tablets in heaven? Since there are so much difference from the Quran we are using today, then where is the original manuscript for the 1924 Hafs text used around the world? We're still waiting. Now, just some new information that's come in yesterday from a scholar who is now authority on this manuscript. And he just talked to me on the phone yesterday, and he says that the lower text is much more prolific than what Asma Hilali has found. She did not do a very authoritative job. But then she admitted in the interview just a week and a half ago that she is not a scholar in this area. So that's unfortunate. So far, this is the only published work we have to which to go on. He said that there are much more of the lower text and that it contains almost 11% of the Quran. Ooh, and he says, wait till you find out what we've now found in that lower text. It does not agree. And it has even more damaging variants than what she has put out. And he says that the lower text he actually puts earlier than Uthman. In fact, he said the lower text could be even pre-Muhammad, pre-632. And he says this could be the text that is from Kufa, that is from Iraq. This could be Ibn Masud's text that all the traditions talk about. And remember, we talked about the Qira'at last week, and we talked about the fact that, and I just said it earlier today, that there are these other manuscripts there in Damascus and in Kufa, and also in Damascus, Kufa, and also in Basra that do not agree with the manuscript that was put together by Zayd ibn Thabit. Could be this lower layer be part of that manuscript, the Masud manuscript, because he said it follows what we now know about Masud's not closely, but it does follow in some cases. Could it be a nascent or another text that is from up north? Ooh, man, this is fun because everything we're finding is from up north. I just found this out yesterday. So the upper layer, he says, represents about 50%. So 50% for the upper layer. He's saying that the lower layer could be anywhere from 11 to 41% of the Quran. He's still now looking at all of it, and he's finding out an awful lot of text down there. Now, folks, this is exciting because this is happening as we speak. This is going on while we're talking. And that's why I say, hold on. We're going to find an awful lot more about these manuscripts that has yet to be published or yet to be uncovered. Now, he dates the upper layer to the mid-8th century, not to the early. He does not date to 705. He actually dates it to about the same time as the Topkapi, this one here, that is dated by the other scholar to around 747, so mid-8th century. Great stuff. Exciting.